All right, here we are with another stringing hangout. Hey, Brad, how are you doing? How are you
Hey,
doing today?
hi Patrick. All right, good
It's
to
good to
see you.
see you. Yeah, I think today we have some specific things that we want to go over, and of course, it always leads into some other stringing tips and just hacks and just other things we just like to talk about when we get together here. But I did want to make sure that we touched on stringing patterns and when you first, it kind of takes me back to when I first started stringing. It's like when you first look at a racket that doesn't have any strings in it and you're going, what do I do with this? I mean, how do I string this? You know,
Yeah,
when you fast forward 20 years, you're going, I can't believe I even, would have to look at a racket and figure that out, right? But, so this first part is really for those beginners or for those stringers who are still looking at stringing patterns when they're trying to figure out how to string a racket. And sometimes a new racket comes out and we it has some really specific ways that you need to string it based on possibly the way the grommets are designed or the
right.
way the frame is designed, especially when you're using two-piece, or if you choose to do around the world a one-piece stringing. You have
Yeah,
to kind of figure out, and you need to know how to string that racket properly. And so if we think about the idea of looking at a racket that doesn't have any strings on it, and what do I do with that? Of course, there are some key areas that we want to look at on a racket. And so we'll get into all that. But really, I want to touch on these four things. I want to talk a little bit about why we would do that. I mean, why we even need to know this information, or why, a beginning stringer would need to know that. What to look for specifically on the racket, reading stringing patterns, like how do you read the stringing patterns, right?
right.
And then where do you go to find these stringing patterns? So I want to touch on those four things specifically, and then after that, I know we have some fun stuff that you wanted to also go over, Brad, as far as some specific stringing patterns of some of the top players out there on tour. We always like to look at some of those as far as like what kind of racket setup they're playing with, as far as the configuration of the string patterns, whether it's a 16 by 19, whether it's a 18 by 20, or anything in between, right?
Yeah,
So those are some things, and then of course there's some other things that we want to discuss. But I kind of wanted to go into the stringing pattern and talk a little bit more about that from the beginning. So this first part really is for those stringers who haven't had a lot of experience with stringing rackets and haven't seen a number of rackets, and so they're a little. Sometimes there's a little bit of confusion of where the mains and the crosses, or where the crosses start, and
right.
which holes on the mains that you skip. For some rackets, if you look at a racket, you know, you can kind of tell by looking at it, oh, okay, well, these are the mains, these are the crosses, but it's not
Yeah,
always so clear. If you look at some, let's look at Babolat rackets. Babolat rackets, they tend to, sometimes the outer main seems to be a little bit further away from the rest of the mains. It kind of has a little bit more spacing. And so, if there's no strings in the racket, sometimes you're like, okay, is this a main or is this a cross? Which hole do I skip? And usually, I think most of the questions are those areas where the first main, or I mean, where the last main is, and where that first cross is on the top and on the bottom of the racket, right? On the head or the throat. And
right,
so
right.
those are the areas usually. So around, you know, 11 o'clock, 1 o'clock, if you use that, if you use that analogy,
Sure.
or around 5 o'clock and 7 o'clock, right? Those are the areas where you probably are going to have the most difficulty figuring out what, which one is the main and which one is the crosses. And when I first got started stringing, and I would get a racket that didn't have the strings on it, I'd be like, oh no, what do I do now?
Yeah,
Because if a racket comes in and it has the strings on it, I would study that and I would go, okay, so I need to skip this hole, I need to skip that hole. Sometimes I would make a little mark or put a little piece of something on the racket. Obviously, the mark, if it's something that, I could just take off easily, especially if it's your own racket. I noticed a lot of times when I would get rackets in from people who did their own stringing initially, but then they went and had me string it. They'd have like marks on where where you're skipping a hole, or or the, they would put a mark at the 12 o'clock or at 6 o'clock, so they know where to mount it on the machine and so forth.
Yeah.
So you see all that. So there are people that this kind of information is really valuable and helpful, right? So knowing all of that, where do you go from, where do you go with that? Well, if it's your racket, experimenting with that and figuring out, okay, yeah, this is where it goes. That's the best way to kind of do it, right? But that takes time, and takes a lot. Might make some mistakes on that. Obviously, you don't want to do that when you're stringing for somebody else. I mean, I've seen some racket jobs come back to me that other people have done, and I mean, they completely messed it up. Where, like, I mean, this, you would think, for me, it was obvious that this is obviously not a cross and it's a main where it's supposed to go. But sometimes it's really close, like the last, because if you look at where the hole configurations are, sometimes there's 3 grommet holes really close together, usually at 7, at 1 o'clock, 11 o'clock, and then 7 and 5 o'clock, right? A lot of times there'll be 3 grommet holes fairly close together. And sometimes, you might be right at the top, but then you kind of go a little bit crooked. And have you ever seen that? Like they use the wrong hole for the wrong.
Yep. I have seen it, not too often, but it's thrown me off. What am I looking at here? Wait a minute. They've changed direction that this grommet should be facing. They strung it wrong, and so.
Yeah, and there's some rackets that are actually, they do kind of taper a little bit, or they're not exactly parallel on the top and the bottom, right? There's some rackets that are like that. So you really need to make sure for yourself. And if you are just fairly new, or you just haven't had a lot of experience, you need to figure out how to make this happen, right?
Yeah.
So it all comes to learning stringing patterns and being able to read stringing patterns. And so what I decided to do is kind of actually show on the stream here where you could get stringing patterns and what they look like and how they're a little bit different and how to read those numbers. So I kind of wanted to look a little bit at that. So the first place is, of course, you can go to Tennis Warehouse, right? So, if you go to Tennis Warehouse and you just go onto the site and you choose a racket, right? And you go down, and right there, you can see where the stringing patterns are, right? You can kind of see right here, they'll show you all this information. They'll tell you what to skip. If you look at, this one specifically, still kind of going there. I wanted to go down a little bit. Let's see here. Did it skip on me? Let's see. Yeah, down toward the bottom where it says string patterns, 16 mains, 19 crosses, and then it tells you, let's see. This is like the first time that I've used. Okay, there we go. And it tells you what to skip. It'll say main skip 7 throat, 8 throat, and 7 head and 9 head, right?
Yeah.
And so by looking at that right away, you can just count on your racket starting in the middle and count outward, right? And then, you count, like, okay, count the mains, 1, 2, 3, 4, until you get to the ones that you skip. And then, right there, those are the ones that you are going to skip when you're stringing the mains. So it gives you an explanation here. So you can pretty much get this kind of information for most of the rackets that are out in production right now on the Tennis Warehouse site. Now, if you have a racket, let's say, that is maybe out of date, that's 10, 20 years old, you're not going to find it on all of the websites, especially the manufacturing websites. Sometimes you will find some old popular ones, but maybe not some of the real specific ones. And so what I have found, and I think you found this as well, if you go to Clipper USA, right, they're the ones that make the ClipperMate stringing machine, the drop weight one. They've been making that one for 20, 30 years. You can go on their site and they have all these racket stringing patterns. I looked under Babolat and you can see all of the different ones. Now they list things a little bit different. You have to look at the legend there and figure out exactly what all these these letters mean, because
Yeah.
they don't use T for throat and H for head. They use T for top and B
Yeah.
for bottom. So
Yeah.
you have to be able to read, understand what what their acronyms are. But you can see all of the rackets right there under Babolat that they have listed, and they tell you all the information, what the manufacturing, what they recommend for stringing, pound wise, and all those kind of things. So that's if you go to Clipper USA. Now, if you want more specific information, if you go to the manufacturer site directly, some
Right.
of them do a really good job of this information. Like if you go to, let's see here. I'm sorry. Let me start this one over. If you go to, oh, that's the Tennis Warehouse one. Let's see. If you go to head tennis and go under rackets, and then you see a racket, click on a racket, and then it will take you to this page where it gives you all the information, the specs and so forth. And down under product information, it has stringing instructions. You click on
Yeah.
that, then you get a little PDF. You click on that, it downloads it for you, and then you open it up, and boom, then you have a very detailed instruction sheet. I mean, they tell you exactly where to start, how much string you need, the centimeter, how far it is from each hole, where to start, where the tie-offs are, and you can follow this diagram, and it tells you where all the tie-offs are, whether you're using a one-piece or a two-piece, and you can study this guide, and it tells you all that information that you need to know.
Yeah.
So I
That's
thought
great.
that was a helpful one. And
Yeah.
the other one was Yonex. They did a good job as well. So you go on, you're looking at the E-Zone, let's say 98, and you click on that, and then it tells you some specs there. You go to stringing instructions, and there you go. You have the same information and where to start, where the tie-offs are. And this one, you can even see where you'd start, because you have four loops at the bottom, so you're going to start at the top. That's what the arrow's for, and it simplifies these kind of things. So I have really found this information to be really useful for if there's a new racket that's out there that maybe has some unique specs on the stringing, or if you're teaching somebody new how to string, or if you've just been stringing for a couple years and you're just not that comfortable with doing it on your own. Maybe new racket comes in for you, because some of the rackets have kind of flared grommets, right? So you can't sometimes tell if the grommet is for the main or the cross just by looking at the grommet,
Right.
because it's maybe not direction. It's
Right.
not showing you the direction that the string would normally go. Because if a racket's been strung a bunch, you can tell, because the grommets are kind of pointing either horizontal or vertical, kind of toward whether it's a main or a cross string. So if you get a new racket, or it's got some of those flared grommets like some of the manufacturers do, then going to one of these places to get that information, I think, is valuable. Now, I think you also have one other resource that is also valuable for this, but all the four that I've mentioned are all free. You can find them all online. But Brad?
Yeah, those are great. And my only complaint would be, if you go to Tennis Warehouse or some of the other ones, I do think it's important to make sure the designated hole they recommend you tie off in, and you don't get those on like the Tennis Warehouse. You did get those when you went to Head, when you went directly to Yonex. I think that's important. A lot of times it's obvious, but just be careful, because sometimes the manufacturer will have it in an area maybe it wasn't as obvious to you. So, but yeah, so this is put out by the USRSA, the United States Racket Stringers Association. If you're a member, you get one every year. This is a hard copy. I think now we can opt for a digital version, which I may do for this upcoming year. This is great because it's got a ton of every racket, whether it be squash, right, racquetball, tennis. It's got all the patterns, all the knots, where to tie, where to skip, whether it's a two-piece, one-piece, where you start. So this is great. And I always use this. And what I do is, every time I get a new client, is I have a page in a 3-ring binder where I actually go on the website and print out a digital version of their racket pattern. So if I don't see them for a while, I just open the 3-ring binder to their name, and there it has the pattern for their racket and all the things I need to know. Once in a while, you're going to get into a racket that has you start on a specific half of the crosses. So they are labeled, but sometimes you just forget. So it's a good idea, even if you think you know the patterns. What I do is if I get a racket and I have not strung it before, I take a picture of it if the strings are still in it. So now I have a visual of the string pattern in there of what they did. And then I also go to this, because you don't want to rely on what the previous stringer did if it wasn't you. Because like you had mentioned earlier, they may botch it a little bit. So I think it's important. Number one is I take a picture of the string pattern, and then I also look it up and make sure that I've got exactly the specs the manufacturer wanted for that racket. So yeah, so that's great.
Yeah, that's a lot of really good information. And when you were showing that, I was also thinking, like, when I start maybe getting into squash or string and badminton a little bit more, I'll probably be looking at a book like that, because when you're looking at badminton rackets, they have a lot of shared holes.
Yeah.
Badminton rackets have a lot of shared holes, and I'm not going to always catch how far up the top you need to go with the shared hole, because I might look at it and go, oh, okay, that looks fine for me, but and so I think something like that is definitely going to be helpful, in some of the sports where maybe you don't have as much experience with racquetball, right, or something like that doesn't come across every day.
Speaking of which, I got my first squash string in the mail.
All right.
So I am ready to do my first squash racket this coming year. So I'm excited about this.
What gauge is that? What kind of string is that?
This is 120. So I asked a guy in London. I think he's in England. John, he does some YouTube videos and stuff, but he's a squash stringer and tennis. He's on a Bayardo also. And I said, John, what 2 strings should I carry? I might get some squash players. He said, carry this and Ashaway. He gave me both strings. He said, if you have those 2 strings, you have 2 great strings, and they're in every pro shop of people that are stringing for squash. So this is Technifiber 305 120 gauge. So
okay, so here's a real newbie question. Okay, so with the squash, with the 120, why don't you? So what's different between that and tennis string? Is just the kind of string it is? I mean, it's not on the tennis. I mean, it's a different different type of filament, or?
Great question. I said, look, John, I have Hyper G 120. He said, you do never want to put polyester in a squash racket. So,
there you go. I wouldn't have known that. So
yeah, I have a long way to go, but he's my go-to guy. In this book, this USRSA will be invaluable for that too. But again, it's just a matter of, one of the reasons you and I like doing these videos, it just keeps us studying and educating ourselves and just rereading things that maybe we haven't read in 4 or 5 years. And so that's what I like about this type of stuff, is it just keeps the mind sharp a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. So really, just, I guess, summing up with the stringing patterns, really, you're looking for understanding when a racket comes in, or you have a new racket to string. Could even be your own. You maybe just got a new frame and it doesn't have strings in it. It's never been strung. So, you want to make sure that you get it right the first time, because, if you screw up a string job on the first time, you could mess up the grommets. You could rip into your frame, or you could just kind of bend the grommets the wrong way and just really mess this up for future stringings. And so it's important to get that right. And if you just aren't confident and sure initially, find one of these resources. Go online, all those free resources, or join the USRSA if you want more specific help on those things. And then you can get one of those books on a yearly basis that have all the updated rackets that come out and so forth. And it helps you across the spectrum of racket sports as well. And then, of course, understanding how to read the patterns. It's not too difficult, but you got to understand. You got to understand the basic makeup of a racket. What all the components of a racket are, from the throat, the head. What does it mean when somebody says at 1 o'clock or 3 o'clock, or talks about the throat or the palate or the grip or the see, what are some other words? The beam, thickness of the beam, all those kind of things. It's important to kind of understand that lingo when you're dealing with tennis rackets and so forth. And so those are the things I just wanted to kind of point out, kind of a refresher of stringing patterns, where to find them, getting all that information so that you can kind of get better at it. And as you become better, you're not going to use a lot of this information, but at first, if you know where to get it, it could really help your journey down that road. So
yeah, and another thing is, some of the new models are not going to be in here yet, so you're going to have to go to what you recommended there, is go directly to the manufacturer's website, because they'll have the new patterns before this book is printed.
Yep. I mean, some of those companies do a really good job of the diagrams and really drawing it out, and you have the really good visual. So if you're a visual person, sometimes going to the individual sites is great. So so that's all I have as far as that's concerned, since we have kind of like we'll call this our intermission going into the next segment. We just had our holidays. We had Christmas. We had a good, great celebration there. We always, like to celebrate the birth of Christ and all that's surrounding that. But what's your favorite holiday food?
Oh, my favorite holiday.
Yeah, what's your favorite holiday food?
I guess I always seem to have, stuffing, mashed potatoes, and macaroni and cheese. Those
really?
are my three.
You have macaroni and cheese for the holidays?
Isn't that funny? We had it last night. We had it for Thanksgiving. I love it. So yeah, those are my go-to comfort foods. How about you?
Well, speaking of mac and cheese, actually, we were at Target today, and my daughter wanted Panera mac and cheese, and they had it there because we don't have Panera bread, restaurants here in Hawaii. And so, she always wanted to try the Panera mac and cheese.
I have a friend who loves it. There's one 2 miles from my house. I've had it.
Yes. Before. Oh, wow. Yeah. So she got that. But okay. So for me, it's more of a dessert because I grew up in Germany. And so I had a lot of sweets, and, that's just around the holidays. There's all those like great chocolates and all sorts of things. And in Germany, there's something called marzipan. It's kind of like an almond paste kind of thing. Okay. And they have this thing called marzipan Stolle, which is like a loaf of, it's like, I guess the closest thing in America to it would be what do you call it? Not candy cake. I can't remember the name of it now. It's you have a lot of like oh man, I can't think of the name of it now. But anyways, it's basically like it has fruit, like a fruit cake. It's kind of like the closest thing to it in America would be a fruit cake.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
And we don't like fruit. I mean, fruit cakes don't taste that good, right? I mean, they're kind of like, right. But no, this is completely different. It's kind of like, it has marzipan, which is like an almond paste kind of thing. And it's just like a kind of a sweet dessert kind of thing. It's almost like cake, but it's hard to kind of explain what it is. But that's kind of like my holidays, some of those German like chocolates and things like that.
Right.
Because for meals, I'm happy with, just regular, holiday meals or fish, or even, sometimes we'll have fish. And we're actually having stuffing tonight, still for the holidays. So,
nice.
But so for me, it's been that. So yeah, mac and cheese, that's one of your favorites. That's cool. But all right. So I guess we have a little more that we wanted to cover today. And I think you kind of are going to head that, because I think you did your research on that a little bit more.
I did a little bit of research, talking as you just covered with string patterns and stringing. I looked into string patterns and kind of what they offer, and what string patterns are the players using, as far as 16 by 18, 16 by 19, 16 by 20, 18 by 19, 18 by 20. And for anyone that's kind of new to this, I think we all probably understand this unless you get someone who's new to tennis. But whatever number you say first refers to the vertical strings going from top to bottom. So if it's a 16 by 19 string pattern, that means there's 16 mains. Those are the strings go top to bottom. And then the 19 refers to the horizontal cross strings. So most of the pros typically seem to be in a 16 to 19 pattern. But you have a few who, like Djokovic, is in an 18 by 19, and Daniil Medvedev, both in the U.S. Open finals this past year, are in an 18 by 19 pattern. And what are you getting out of the different patterns is kind of like it goes into, you know, they select a racket for certain reasons, head size, stiffness, flex, balance, weight. But they also, you know, in addition to looking at a string that they want that'll match their game, you also look at the pattern. And there are patterns that you don't see so much in the pros. There are some rackets that have 14 mains. And basically the rule of thumb is the bigger the squares. Okay, let me grab a racket here. So the bigger these squares, the more spin you're going to get. The more power, the more trajectory the ball is going to kind of take off in a more upward position off the strings. So most of the yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, and part of the reason is why that happens is because that's what we call the snapback, right? So
Right.
if you take the string and you move it, right,
as you hit a top spin here, right, you go up, these strings here pull down,
right, and then they snap back, right. And so when there's more spacing between the holes, they have a chance to go further back, right? It's like almost like a bow and arrow, right? The further you pull it back, the more power you have when you let it go.
And you'll get advanced, beginner, intermediate type players who want a really open string bed, because maybe they don't have the acceleration, they don't have the form, the technique to generate it themselves. So they do want a nice assist from the racket. Most of the pros, you won't, they won't deal with that because they're just hitting way too hard, that they want to be able to tame that beast a little bit. So they're going to have a little bit tighter string bed. But then you had, you know, that was one of the things that Djokovic, with support from Roman Prokes, you know, Roman Prokes, you know, Djokovic was in an 18 by 20, and Roman Prokes suggested they get rid of one of those crosses just to open it up a tiny bit, and I guess maybe give him a tiny bit more spin, a tiny bit more power, possibly by opening that up a little bit. But that was just something that he suggested, and it worked well for Djokovic. Federer is in a 16 by 19 also. Nadal's in a 16 by 19. Medvedev, we said, is 18 by 19. And Tsitsipas in an 18 by 20. But also you take into consideration the head size of the racket and how spaced out are the grommets. And a lot of times in some rackets, you'll see that the grommets in the middle are a little closer, right? So that's more of the sweet spot. And as you get to the wider frame, they're a little wider, not necessarily in this racket, but some rackets, that way, if you hit off center, it's a little more forgiving with a little bit wider square.
Like Babolat is one that tends to have, you know, more spacing on the outer too, right?
Yeah, but most of the pros, they're not, you know, they're hitting mostly in the sweet spot and stuff.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what you see on the pros. But you've got Djokovic, he's in a 95, you know, head size, 95 square inch. Federer at 97. Nadal's in a 100. So, you know, Nadal's in a little bit bigger head size. So it, you know, you might get a tiny bit more open space with those squares, tiny bit bigger squares. But it's just kind of neat to see, you know, Serena Williams 18 by 19, Ashley Barty 18 by 19, Sabalenka is in an 18 by 20, Muguruza is in a 16 by 19, Pliskova 16 by 19. So you really don't see fewer than 16 mains with any of these pros, and I haven't seen any with less than 18. I suppose it's possible, but or less than 19 rather crosses. You know, you see 19 or 20 usually. So those are some of the things you take into consideration. I have a guy that I string for, and he uses a pretty durable string, Gamma Ochoa. It's a string that really bites. His string pattern is 14 mains by 16 crosses, I believe it is. And so, you know, you can string it in no time. But he doesn't like how often the strings break, and it's not that often. Maybe it's probably every 25 hours of him playing. He hits pretty hard and stuff. But, you know, I basically told them you know, the reason you have such a wide open string pattern, that doesn't help, right? That doesn't help. The strings are moving so much, you're going to break strings faster with a big wide open pattern like that.
Yeah.
Compared to a real stiff, you know, a real closed string bed. So, you know,
Yeah.
there's drawbacks, but it's fun. I mean, as a stringer, I love a 14 main racket. You know?
Yeah. I think we talked about that in another episode one time, because I used to like the Prince Graphite too.
Yeah, right. That was my favorite.
Mid-size, right? The mid-size one, and it was 14 mains. I remember specifically, and boy, you could string that racket in no time. But yeah, I was breaking a lot of strings, especially with the 17 or 18 gauge.
Yeah. So when you're looking at your rackets and you've kind of you know, you're not able to tame things the way you want it with the right string, you know, you can look into the pattern. Maybe you need a little bit tighter pattern to kind of rein it in a little bit if you're not able to control your shots as well. And then, you know, when you do have a tighter pattern, since the strings don't break quite as often, maybe you can go into something a little bit softer, and it'll make up for it now that you're in a tighter pattern. You don't need that stiff polyester anymore, because a tight pattern with a stiff string is really going to be like a board. So you're right. You might be
Yeah.
able to adjust and try different strings and stuff.
Yeah, and that's why you just really have to try those different things, change up some of the variables, right?
Yeah,
You know, if you have a racket, you know, your racket is a bigger investment usually than string or other things. And so, of
right.
course, you get your playing style. That's your primary. Then your racket would be your secondary, and then you've got your string and the tensions. Those are things that are things that you can vary a little bit easier. So, you know, changing up the string, whether you're going to a thinner gauge, also, you know, checking out the tension, you know, increasing or going a little bit lower based on what you're looking for, trying those things first. Of course,
Yeah,
using only changing one variable at a time. I just did a little video recap of that. You know, just, you know, we talked about that in another video as well, where we just, you know, change one variable at a time, so you know what it is
yeah,
that's the difference. So
right.
we have a few people that came on the stream, so I just wanted to acknowledge them.
Oh,
We
let
had
me get
We
over
had
to
Jim on
comments.
there, yeah, in the comments,
Oh
and so
yeah.
we had Jim came on a little bit earlier, and he was wondering if sometime we could touch on different changes from summer outdoor to winter indoor, tension, and the different hybrid choices. Okay,
That's an interesting. If I can
yeah,
just let me just speak on that for 1 second, because I don't know. I don't think I reached out to you. I almost did, but it was such a quick thing that I had to figure out. I have a player that I work with who I string for. He's heading out. He left today to go to Tucson for winter nationals. For I think he's in the 14 and unders, or is he in the 14 and under. So it's in Tucson. And where he practices here, it's about 300 elevation, right? The altitude is 300. In Tucson, it's about 2,400 elevation. So we talked about, should we make an adjustment to the strings? Should we tighten it a few pounds because he's going up in elevation? My
right,
initial thought was, yeah, we should probably string it 2, 3, 4 pounds tighter, because the ball will fly a little more freely in the air. It's like having a tiny fraction of a bit of helium in that
right,
ball.
right.
Like
I
when
was
golfers in high altitude, they get a longer
Exactly,
drive.
right. I was
So
just reading something that about 4,000 feet, that's where the altitude really makes adjustments for tennis. I mean, as far
oh,
as going to high altitude, I mean, like different manufacturers are going to recommend going to the high altitude balls, right? That don't bounce quite
yes,
like
that's at
um,
4,000 feet, the high
that's at
altitude
right.
balls.
That's kind of the breaking point, or the, you know, the changing point. from what I've heard. But you know, if it's less than, if you're at less than 4,000 altitude, and you're having problems, you know, you could adjust that too. You know, first, of course, go a little tighter on the strings. That's probably what you're referring to. You know, tightening it up a little so you have a little bit more control of that bounce, and then maybe going with those high altitude balls, which will
Well,
reduce
I
the
reached
bounce
out to 3 people quickly. I reached out to Mark, the president of the Eastern Racket Stringers Association. I reached out to Bob at the United States Racket Stringers Association, and I shot a quick email to Paul, the Wimbledon stringer, right? And fortunately, all 3 got back to me, and it was really really neat to hear their different perspectives. And Paul mentioned how Madrid, Spain is, I guess, at like 2,800 feet. And from what he hears, players, you know, or what he's done will go up 3 or 4 pounds. And the USRSA, they said what they agreed what I told them I was going to do, 2-3 pounds tighter. They said that sounded good to them, made sense to them. And same thing with Mark. He had some experience playing in Aspen, so he spoke on that at higher altitude in Aspen, Colorado. But they all basically agreed with 2 to 4 pounds. But more importantly, have a racket strung there by the stringer, one racket, try it, see how it feels, and then make adjustments based on that. So
yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and we have some other folks here too. We got Alan. He came in a little bit late, so he says hi, and then we have
Jason.
Yeah.
Some
Let's
pros
see. I know
have
some
mains.
pros have mains a few pounds higher than the crosses. Why is that? And what's the pros and cons using different tension on main versus crosses? I think sometimes for me, the first thing I think of when adjusting string tension on crosses and mains is looking at the type of string that I'm using. Because in general, you know, aside from the fact that I'm using 2 different types of string, if I'm using a polyester, I tend to go lower just in general. Like if you have a tension, like if you throw a tension out to me and say, hey, you know, I'm used to 55 pounds, and that you kind of know what 55 pounds is. Well, that's what I'm using as my reference point. But then if you say, okay, I want to put some polyester in for that 55 pound, well, I would say we probably want to go a few pounds lower than 55 pounds because of you're using polyester string. Now, if you're using a multi-filament or a natural gut, I would probably stick with, you know, the 55 in general, or maybe go a little bit higher depending on, you know, if you want a little bit more control or a little bit more power, right? That's how I'm going to adjust it. And so if you're using a combination of 2 types of string, and one of them is polyester, my first thought is, well, the polyester is going to go a few pounds lower.
Right.
And on the crosses, let's say you're using a natural gut, then sometimes you're probably going to go a little bit tighter on that.
I did that today.
You know?
I had a racket today I did, and I put ALU power in the mains, and we did Babolat gut, the 15L in the crosses. And we did that 2 pounds tighter in the crosses and the mains. And it depends, what are you looking for? The crosses are going to really kind of dictate the trampoline effect of the swing. So if you're looking to tame it a little bit, you can, you know, tighten it up a little bit. If you're looking for a little more power, a little more of that, you can loosen it up. Again, a lot of it is trial and error. There's what makes sense generally, but there's no general player out there. Everyone's kind of unique, and everyone has their own feel and their own likes. That's why there's, you know, I don't know how many. We figured out we were told there's over 2,000 types of string. There's hundreds of rackets out there. There's
and you want to think about, because you are using 2 types of string, you want to get the best benefit out of both of them, right? You have the opportunity to get 2 variations of, I guess, the best of those strings. And so how are you going to do that? And, you know, if you know and understand kind of the purpose of the main strings and what their job is in the racket, and you understand the purpose of the cross strings, you can somehow formulate the best setup for you.
Right.
And that's kind of where we start, and that that's kind of a lot of information, so we probably don't really want to get into that. We kind of don't have too much more time that we want to go over, or too many more things we want to go over today. But I think that might be a good video. Sometime we can spend time just specifically going over you know creating the best hybrid for yourself. And I don't know, we've probably had some videos, but hybrid seems to be the topic that everybody, because there's so many different variables, there's so many different components to that, there's so many different aspects of hybrids. So I think we could just keep going with hybrids forever.
Yeah. And then
Talking
outdoor
about
to
it.
indoor, what has your experience been from
Mhm.
stringing, whether you're playing outdoors or going indoors, adjusting that tension or?
Yeah, are you talking to me, or are you talking
Yeah,
just?
yeah. Well, I think there was one other question about that. Would you adjust it
Yeah.
going out? Now,
Oh
outdoors, you
yeah.
have
Oh yeah.
those
Yeah. Yeah. It's
out.
been a while. Since I don't live in a place that has indoor courts, and so, but thinking back, because I used to live in a place that had indoor courts, and I can't really remember. I mean, the thing is, you've got so many climate. The reason you have indoor courts is because the climate's so aggressive, right?
Yeah,
Because you can't play outside. So it's either really cold. I remember playing in indoor courts, and it's really cold outside. So you
yeah,
take your rackets into from the cold into, where it's still it's still cooler inside of a dome, you know, for the most part than it is than than it is if you're just playing outside. So
yeah.
think of the racket is a little bit colder, the strings are a little bit colder. So think about that then, before,
Right.
how are you going to handle that, if it's a little bit colder,
Yeah.
with the strings.
What I did myself usually is outside there's those variables, there's the wind, there's the, just different things you don't experience inside. So if you want to kind of string it a couple pounds tighter outside, um, just for that whole idea of there's just different things you're tackling, right? And then inside you kind of like everything's the same. You string it a tiny bit looser, a little bit more power. You don't have to worry about these external like outdoor things that you have to worry, about indoors. But again, you could just try it and play it. I like to string as loose as I can for my arm and comfort, as well, as long as I can contain the ball and it doesn't start getting away from me too often. So I prefer to string loose with a nice soft string, and then make the adjustments accordingly. And that's one of the reasons that hitting a lot of spin is great, because you can kind of swing crazy and the ball will kind of dip and stay in. And Alan was talking about the knot function for I had a knot function on well I have one on I had one on my Babolat,
Hmm.
or no, on my Gamma Progression ELS, that would take it, I think, 5 or 10 pounds tighter on the knot, whichever one I
Hmm.
wanted. And then on the Bayardo, you can
It's
just
percentage. Yeah, you can
it's
do a
percentage.
percentage. Hmm.
Yeah. So, well, the Bayardo is pounds. I put in my
Yeah.
pounds. You hit the
Okay.
knot,
Right.
and
You can do that
so
too. Yeah. So I'm really
yeah,
surprised that they would limit it to 6 pounds, because that's what Alan
yeah,
was saying
that's
on the
odd. That's
Technofiber machine.
Technofiber.
0 to 6 pounds less on the mains. Pretty restrictive. Yeah. I mean,
One
obviously, there's probably ways you can get around. I mean, all you have to do is just change it. But
Now, Alan, this is if you're still out there, this is interesting because we had this seminar a month or two ago, and we learned that at Wimbledon, the head stringer now, who's in charge, all the stringers do the knot tension at 8.5, about 4 kilometers or 4 kilograms over, 8.5, approximately 8.5 pounds over. So that's what they do it now, and you'll get people, you kind of get somewhat, experts on both sides who say leave it alone. No, others say no, make it tight. Now, the pros, what string do they feel when they pick up a racket? It's usually maybe the outer one and the inner one. And if they're feeling the outer one and it's moving like it was hardly pulled, they don't like that. Even though they don't ever hit the ball there,
Mhm.
they just don't want it loose.
Mhm.
So I figure, well, look, if all the pros at Wimbledon are doing 8.5 pounds over, these are all the pros that are using the Wimbledon stringer. Some of them have their own contracted stringers who are at hotels, but these are all the pros, and the majority of them are using the Wimbledon stringing team. So they do 8.5 pounds over. So if that's good enough for the Wimbledon players, that's what I do for my clients now. I like that. I used to do about 5-6 pounds, but now I do this. And if someone doesn't want that, they can tell me. I'll certainly do what anyone wants. But it works for me, and you're going to lose tension. A lot of it has to do with your strength, to pull that knot in, what knot you're using. So that's kind of the USRSA. Where Patrick and I were both certified.
Mhm.
Patrick, well before me, was a master racket technician. I got my certification maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago. Patrick, you've been what, 20 years now, or
Yeah, it's been a while. So
so
yeah,
they teach
2000,
don't don't tension the last string tighter, because if you happen to mishit the ball, which the pros really aren't mishitting that far over, but for the average player that we're stringing for, that mishits it over, it's going to be more forgiving if it's real
Mhm.
loose on the outside. So that was
Yeah.
kind of the USRSA's reasoning behind it, and that makes sense to me also.
Mhm. And sometimes you really just have to look at what your clientele is that you're stringing to. A
Yes.
lot of times, my reference point might be just, my local clients, or it might be if you're at a tournament, sometimes you have to change your mindset a little bit and go, okay, now, I'm in this ballpark and this is how I need to
Yeah.
handle the strings and the stringing. And it's consistency is key there. And so, however you're going to be more consistent and get that job done. And
Yeah, there's
there's
another good
certain rules.
question
Yeah.
by Jason.
Yeah. He had a good question on if I bring two rackets, is that the one you're talking about? If I bring
Yeah.
two rackets to a match, should I string them different tension? If so, how should I use them strategically? Yeah, well, you know what? If you just have two, here's my 2 cents on that, and then you can chime in on that. But my 2 cents would be, obviously depends on what your level you're at, and if you have a lot of control over, if you can control the ball pretty well with any type of tension, right? That'd be
Yeah.
the first thing. But really, when I think about, you know, I like a racket a certain feel, and if I just have two rackets and I'm playing a match or something, I want them to be pretty right on as far as the same,
Yeah.
consistent. Because if something happens, I break a string and I pick up the other one, I don't want it to be 2 or 3 pounds different and have some issue. Now, if you have a third racket and maybe you want it a little bit tighter so that when you get some new tennis balls or you're serving, to have a little, a little bit more control, or just look consistency that when you want just a crisp racket like that, then I would maybe adjust the tension and have one that's a little bit tighter. That's just how I would do it. But if I only
Yeah.
had two rackets, I would have them the same, just because if you snap one, I want to have one where I can go to the next point and have it feel fairly the same as what I was just hitting with.
Yeah, that's right. And Alan chimed in real quick that he has heard a professional string a series of rackets, slightly
Oh
different
yeah.
tensions, and
Yeah.
that's true. And they're walking on the court with 6, 8,
Six.
10 rackets,
Uh-huh.
and they've got someone in the stands who can go get them another two if they want it. But here's something to keep in mind. And I was with a few players today. We had a small, or just I was with two girls earlier. One a former player at Notre Dame, one a current player at Notre Dame, and the former player is on this WTA tour now, doing fairly well at doubles, and played main draw at Wimbledon this year. And so I was talking to her a little bit about, and matter of fact, she brought up Nate Ferguson. She just had all her grips. Um, what's the right word? She just had Nate do all her grips so they all match. Apparently, all these Babolat rackets she had all had a different grip shape, and
Okay,
it's
so they were,
crazy. So
yeah,
it's like, yeah, so Nate fixed all
yeah.
her grips to match. So
And
down
and
in
Nate is with priority one.
yeah, Nate with priority one, and Ron Hughes with him, right?
Hmm.
He's Federer stringer, and
Yeah.
Nate does a ton. And she said it was pretty. I think she said it was down in Florida somewhere, his shop, and she just said it was wild. Rackets everywhere, everywhere. So I just strung a racket for the other girl who's currently playing at Notre Dame, and I took a screenshot of my Excel spreadsheet, and it's hard. It's going to be hard for you to see here, but so if you can see where it says app 64, the blue line above the orange, right? See the blue line above the orange? So I read, so when I strung that racket at 58 pounds, is the second I took it off the machine, I have a an app that listens to the pitch, the harmonics, right? So right when I took it off, I got a reading of 64 pounds. In the morning, I got a reading of 59.6 pounds. I checked it again this morning. So this is about 10 days, or this is about 6 days after I strung it. It's down to 57 pounds. So it went from 64 the second I pulled it off the machine to 57 pounds without her hitting a ball with it 5 or 6 days later. And this is why you'll
Yeah.
hear occasionally Rafael Nadal wanted all his rackets strung 3 hours before his match, because the second you take it off, it starts losing tension a little bit.
Yep.
So, if if we're being that specific about it, you've got to really, you've got to string them almost almost at the same time. I recommend these apps. They listen to the harmonics. It's the same thing. If you've ever seen a guitar, they have that little device you can clip on the neck, and when you play a G chord, it shows it's a G. It's a C chord, it says C. So it's the same thing. It listens to the pitch, and you can kind of keep track of the tension loss. Now, the girl today uses a hybrid setup, so she gets a little bit better tension maintenance because we put a multi-filament in the crosses, Yonex Polytor in the mains, Solinco Vanquish in the crosses. So,
Yeah, I haven't used that app, but I'm gonna look into that a little bit. And the one question I have regarding that app specifically is, so let's say you're checking the tension, but you're in one room, like one environment. The acoustics are different in, let's say, your living room than it is in your car, right? So are you going to have a different frequency if you check that racket in your living room, or if you go outside and sit in your car and do the same thing? Is it going to be different?
It should not. It really shouldn't. I guess I'll test it in different rooms, but I have used those devices for guitars, and I know it's going to be a G whether you're in the car, whether you're upstairs, whether you're in the basement, whether you're outside. It's going to know when you play that G.
That's true. If you're using a stringed instrument, it
now
should be the same.
This is the app that I use, and I'll show you here. And this is kind of my tennis folder app. If you can see it on the bottom, maybe it's too hard to see, but it's called Tennis Tension. It's purple with a white racket. And what you do is you put in the head size, you put in the string pattern, you put in. I did one this afternoon with a polyester 1.2 millimeter. So it does a good job, and then you just hit the strings with another racket or whatever, a pencil, a pen, the back of scissors, and it does a really nice job.
And it's probably cheaper than buying, one of these, basic things, or one of the, electronic ones that I have as well.
It's an $8 app, a one-time payment, $8. So it's definitely worth. Now I have another. Yeah, there you go. I have another boy I string for. And I recommended that his father put it on his phone so he can help keep track and let me know how it's going. So when I'm not with him, he'll send me updates. Now, he was at the tennis club a week or so ago, and I said, let's go in the locker room, because if you do it on the court, there's a lot of background noise. It's hard. Let's go in the locker room and let's test it on your app and on my app, and we'll make sure our settings are the same, because I wanted to see, is it going to give us the exact same reading? And it did. So it didn't matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I'm gonna
made
have
me
to
feel
check
good.
into that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's great because you can have your clients have that so they can check it for themselves, and then when it gets to a certain point, you might get more business because they're gonna be able to understand a little bit more when it's losing tension, and they're not going to wait too long and lose some performance in their game and so forth. So I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Maybe we should just end on that, because we could keep going forever. But
sure.
For today's stream, I think we talked about string tension and string patterns, where to find. Taking a look at helping you be able to understand stringing patterns and find out where they're at when you need them for your rackets, and tips. Yeah, we talked a little bit about well, some of the tension setups and the string patterns,
Yep.
and then we just kind of went off on that, and ended up here talking
Yeah.
about talking about the tennis tuner again. So
Yeah.
we'll just have to do an episode just on the tennis tuner type
Yeah.
uh, resources, and you can demo the app, and we can also demo some of these other devices and kind of show how they work, and kind of give an explanation of why we would want to use those, and when kind of maybe get a little deeper into that. That might be fun.
Yeah. That sounds great. Yeah.
Yeah.
What
And then
is
I'll look
the Yeah.
and then I'll
Okay.
look
Yeah.
at some of the questions and make sure I maybe we can cover those in another video, or I can do specific videos on just kind of the question of the day kind of thing. So
Yeah. Sounds great.
yeah. Well, thanks for coming on, and have a good rest of the year, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for
Sounds good.
tuning in today. All right.
Thanks, Patrick.
All right. Bye, everyone.
See ya.